Madam President.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, I rise again today to express my objection to President Biden's sweeping vaccine mandate and to offer legislation that would protect Americans from this federal intrusion. As I said yesterday, the federal government has no business mandating COVID-19 vaccination for all Americans. Unfortunately, at least some of my colleagues disagree. The President of the United States said while announcing the mandate, quote, "This isn't about freedom or personal choice." This isn't about freedom or personal choice. It stuns me to think that a sweeping federal mandate could be about anything other than freedom or personal choice. It's like robbing a bank and then saying it's not about the money. Our Constitution was designed to protect the liberties of the people of the United States, but now the government is being used by the executive to force Americans to be vaccinated or to be terminated. Yesterday, I came to the floor to speak about those Americans with sincerely held beliefs, whether religious or otherwise. My bill yesterday would have simply required that any mandate of this sort contain an exemption for those individuals. Now, I don't believe that such an exception would be sufficient to resolve the constitutional and the policy problems with such a mandate. But there are millions of Americans who would be able to live according to their beliefs if, in fact, such an exemption were included by law, which it should be. Lamentably, my colleague, the senior senator from Washington, objected. So I pledged to come back again today and tomorrow for as long as it takes to win the fight against this egregious mandate. Today, I'm providing another opportunity for this body to protect Americans. This mandate poses a real threat to the well-being of millions. Those who choose not to be vaccinated are at risk of losing their jobs. My office has been in contact with 144 Utahns who are concerned about this very issue. I shared some of their stories yesterday. Despite what many on the other side of this debate would have you believe, these are, in fact, everyday Americans. People with pre-existing medical conditions like autoimmune disorders. These are people who are just wanting to provide for their families and not to be able to expect that. These are pregnant mothers who are concerned about the safety of their own health and that of their unborn children. Some of these people are the heroes of yesterday. They're first responders, they're medical professionals and essential workers who sacrificed to carry our nation through the hardest days of this pandemic. And they're still heroes today. These Americans are not the enemy. President Biden and those who support this effort are grasping for solutions they believe can bolster their political position and shift blame on the status of the pandemic. Those paying the price are the people back home, including many of the people I just described. So today I offer another proposal. This bill would provide those Americans harmed by this mandate with a means of recourse. Under this bill, those who lose employment or lose their livelihoods due to this mandate may sue the United States for relief. The bill would make these very Americans whole after the President of the United States made working impossible for them. This bill is only one of many that I've introduced to combat this unconstitutional, unwarranted, indefensible mandate. While I believe this mandate will eventually be invalidated in court, I'm quite confident that it will. Until that day comes, these bills can provide businesses and the American people with the certainty that they need to make their own decisions. We'll be protecting their God-given and constitutionally protected right to make medical decisions for themselves. And so, Madam President, I'm here today, and I'll be back tomorrow in fighting against this mandate for as long as it takes. Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 2840, and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Majority Whip.
More than 680,000 Americans have died from COVID. The majority of these deaths occurred before we had viable, effective, and safe vaccines. Doctors were begging for these vaccines to save lives. And now we have 3 safe, effective, widely available vaccines in America. All 3 have proven successful and safe. However, 1 in 4 adults in America still refuses to get the vaccine. According to CDC, these unvaccinated individuals, listen to this, these unvaccinated individuals are 10 times more likely to be hospitalized from COVID, 10 times more likely to die from COVID than those who got the shot. And as long as large numbers of Americans remain unvaccinated, this virus is going to continue to spread and raise the risk of mutation and more deadly variants. We've tried approaches to incentivize people. What more can we do? We created a lottery in Illinois and said if you're vaccinated, you're automatically buying a lottery ticket. You don't even have to pay for it. The head of the Federal Bureau of Prisons union for employees with only 50% of those working in federal prisons vaccinated said they were going to set up a popcorn machine at the prisons and break room in the hopes of getting people to be vaccinated, trying everything to get people to try the vaccine. We've tried every approach to incentivize them, but the vaccine numbers are not where they need to be. So facing this reality, the president accepted responsibility to try harder. He's directed federal agencies and OSHA to mandate vaccination for federal employees and certain private workers. These directives were issued by OSHA and other established legal authorities, and listen, they've been welcomed by the Business Roundtable and other employers who were waiting for a signal from the White House that we were serious, and they're supported by a majority of the American people. I recognize that some of my colleagues disagree with that action, and that has prompted this bill from my friend and fellow senator from Utah. His bill, the Don't Jab Me Act, would create a private right of action for any, quote, aggrieved individual to sue the federal government, quote, for injuries sustained as a result of COVID-19 vaccination mandate. I know the senator is careful in his words. I would ask him to look carefully at that word injuries. It is misleading. COVID-19 vaccines are safe and effective. They were evaluated in tens of thousands of clinical trials. They meet the FDA's rigorous scientific standards for safety and effectiveness and quality. They've undergone and will continue to undergo the most extensive, intensive safety monitoring in history. In an extremely rare case that an individual suffers an injury, a harm from COVID-19 vaccine, there's a system in place to provide compensation. Under the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, a person can already seek to recover damages for physical injuries suffered because of COVID-19 vaccines. The senator from Utah's bill appears to go beyond compensating individuals for physical injuries caused by the vaccine. It lets people sue the government for, quote, injuries sustained as a result of a COVID-19 vaccine mandate. Now, what kind of injuries might they be? Well, we surely don't know. The bill does not define the type of injuries that a person could sue for. The entire bill is 2.5 pages of very vague language. What we do know is that the bill, if enacted, would authorize a flood of lawsuits by individuals claiming that a vaccine mandate injured them in some physical, maybe, non-physical way. We don't know. It's ironic, for more than a year, my Republican colleagues claimed the pandemic would create a tsunami of COVID lawsuits. Remember all the times Senator McConnell went to the floor and said, hang on tight, the trial lawyers are just going to be hell-bent now, file lawsuits all across America. There'll be a tsunami of lawsuits. Well, it never happened. And despite that fact, the senator from Utah is apparently urging a new set of lawsuits to be filed. I'm a former trial lawyer, made a living at it. When people have been harmed, I support their day in court. But liabilities laws need to be carefully calibrated to promote the right behavior and incentives. This short, vague bill does not even try to strike a balance between health and safety. It's just a shot across the bow aimed at entities that are using vaccine mandates. Remember, courts have long rejected challenges to vaccine requirements imposed by public entities. And the senator might take a look at his home state. In Senator Lee's home state of Utah, the public actors like Salt Lake Community College, the University of Utah, and Utah State University are using COVID vaccine mandates to promote health and safety. And I want to show the Senate this chart because it tells an amazing story. Remember the report about all the attorneys general who were going to file lawsuits in keeping with the senator's message against Joe Biden for these mandates, for these employees? Well, we took a look at their state. 24 states threatened lawsuits against Joe Biden for the very reasons stated by the senator from Utah. How are they doing compared to all the other states, the 26 states that didn't file a lawsuit? Well, it turns out the infection rate for COVID-19 is more than twice in those states as it is in the states not filing these lawsuits. The death rate is almost 3 times the rate of those states that didn't file a lawsuit. And the vaccination rates are significantly lower. So for those who have an idea about guiding a state to the right outcome, shouldn't public health and safety be important? I'm sure we all understand the issue of liberty and how important it is to America, but there was a word before liberty that the Founding Fathers used: life. Life. These vaccine mandates are about saving lives in America, and it's for that reason that I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President, I appreciate the insight provided by my friend and distinguished colleague, the senior senator from Illinois, and the Assistant Majority Leader. I respectfully submit that this is about allowing people to obtain redress for, among other things, the awful Hobson's choice that people are facing and are increasingly going to be facing as this mandate kicks in. Now, it hasn't issued yet. We still don't know what's in it. We still don't know his precise basis for the authority. We assume that he would have told us his precise basis for the authority if, in fact, it existed. I've scoured the United States Code looking for authority for the President of the United States to implement this unilaterally, and I have found none. So it is very significant, therefore, that when you're going to put this kind of a Hobson's choice in front of the people, you ought to be able to at least have the decency to tell them what your source of authority is. He still hasn't done it. If we assume that he's going to come up with one and then he's going to issue a mandate, that mandate is going to put a whole lot of people in a terrible position, forcing them to choose between getting a vaccine that for whatever reason they don't want and termination, between submission and poverty. That's unfair. Now look, I get the fact that a lot of us were and are enthusiastic and grateful for the existence of the vaccine. I've received the vaccine, as has every member of my family. I think the vaccine is a good thing. I also understand that there are people who feel differently. In some cases, there are people who have been advised by board-certified medical doctors not to get the vaccine based on the existence of one or more autoimmune diseases, past personal or family history, and their idiosyncratic reaction to other vaccines or to this vaccine. There are other people who might have religious or other sincerely held personal beliefs that might make this choice a really unfair one for the federal government to force upon them. And so, yeah, I'm glad we've got the vaccine. I think the vaccine's good. I think the vaccine is helping a lot of people. But to tell every American that he or she must get this under penalty of losing a job, and then for the president, after acknowledging that he doesn't have authority to mandate this for every American, turns America's employers, all those with more than 99 employees, into the COVID-19 vaccine police for the entire country is unjustifiable. even at a policy level, before we get to the obvious constitutional defects and the lack of any semblance of any statutory authority. So I'm disappointed that we can't pass this one today. I'll be back again tomorrow. I will continue to come back for weeks to come, because the American people deserve better than this. They deserve not to have people in Washington, D.C. purporting to make very personal health care decisions for them and conditioning their own private sector employment on compliance with the dictate of one man in Washington, D.C.
Madam President.
Madam President.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Help be discharged from further consideration of S-2843 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection? The senator from Washington.
Madam President, reserving the right to object.
Without objection.
This is outrageous. On September 27th, there were over 80,000 new COVID-19 cases and over 1,000 COVID-19 deaths in our country. And yet the next day I had to come to the Senate floor to explain why undermining our efforts to end this pandemic would be reckless. And now 2 days and thousands more cases and deaths later, I have to do it again. And this is the second time today Republicans have tried to do something like this. This virus has killed over 685,000 people in our country. And if people do not get vaccinated, variants like Delta will continue to spread, undermine our economy, and take lives. So why in the world, for the second time in a week, do I have to come down here and explain to some of my Republican colleagues that weakening one of our strongest tools to fight this virus is a dangerous and deadly idea? Getting people vaccinated is one of the most important things we can do to stop COVID-19. And let's be clear, immunization requirements are nothing new in this country. So I hope we can stop with this political theater and focus on ending this pandemic, rebuilding our economy, and keeping people alive. I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, immunizations are nothing new. To a degree, immunization requirements might not be new, but sweeping immunization mandates issued by a single individual within the federal government, that is the President of the United States, are entirely new, entirely unprecedented, entirely unfounded, and dangerous to our constitutional order, to say nothing of its tendency to discourage those who have been reluctant to get the vaccine from getting it. So I've returned to the Senate floor today for the third time this week to express my profound objections to that sweeping mandate, to President Biden's sweeping, promised and still inchoate vaccine mandate, and to offer legislation that this body could have passed right now. It could have passed in order to protect countless Americans from this federal intrusion. Now, look, the federal government has no legitimate role mandating COVID-19 vaccination for all Americans. In fact, the President of the United States has acknowledged that. It doesn't have that role. It doesn't belong to this government. Yes, there have been vaccine mandates in the past. They have never been from the federal government, directed at the entire country. During a really difficult time, economically and otherwise, in which inflation and the jobs market are causing a whole lot of businesses around the country to have to close their doors, President Biden has announced that he's going to enforce this mandate with a really hefty fine. Each incident of a business not fulfilling the mandate could cost a business $14,000. President Biden, under the threat of massive punishment, is co-opting businesses to enforce his mandate. They'll have to police their workforce's personal medical decisions and order the receipt of a vaccination, or alternatively, be forced into bankruptcy. Now, some on the other side of the aisle think that the president's punishment doesn't go far enough. In fact, in the reconciliation bill draft currently being circulated on the other end of the Capitol in the House of Representatives, Democrats are pushing to increase the fine to $70,000 per violation. Look, unvaccinated Americans are not the enemy. They're not the virus, and they're certainly not the enemy. Some are frontline doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals who worked overtime throughout the pandemic, throughout the darkest of the dark hours of the pandemic, treating patients and saving lives. Others are workers whose industries were deemed essential and who showed up to work to ensure Americans kept having access to food and electricity and other essential items and services. Others still are simply neighbors, family members, and other loved ones who have supported friends, families, and entire communities as Americans as a whole struggled through quarantines, shutdowns, financial difficulties, and social isolation. Let me reiterate, as I've said many times before, and I will continue to repeat, I believe the vaccine's development is nothing short of a miracle. It's an answer to prayer. I've been fully vaccinated, as has every member of my family, with my encouragement. But we certainly should not be forcing employers through the federal government without congressional authorization or constitutional authority, putting employers in a position where they have to fire some of their most valuable and now increasingly hard to find workers. We shouldn't be threatening business owners with closure simply because they don't have any desire to police their workforce's personal medical decisions. It's not who we are as a country. I don't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent or a libertarian. Americans as a whole don't believe that that's who we are. We're not into that kind of draconian micromanagement associated with the nanny state, nor are we into the excessive accumulation of power in the hands of the few, or even worse, in the hands of one person. Many simply cannot incur the cost of this enforcement, certainly not in this economy. Additionally, this fine really amounts to a tax. It's government revenue collected from the American people, and the Constitution has a thing or two to say about how revenue bills must be enacted. The Constitution does not vest any taxing, or for that matter, any other revenue-raising or fining authorities in the president alone. No, this is a power that's reserved to the people's representatives in Congress who are charged with precisely that responsibility. We have exclusively that authority, and that authority is not to be exercised by the President of the United States. It's no accident that the Founding Fathers, through the Constitution, put this power in the hands of those people occupying positions in the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals, and in no one else within our government. President Biden's mandate would impose really significant costs on Americans, on American businesses, and on our nation's economy that's already in some really rough times. Look, it's unconstitutional. It hasn't been passed by Congress. It's wrong for America. And that's why today, as I did yesterday and the day before, I came here to offer a proposal that, if enacted, as we could have enacted it today, it would protect Americans from some of the most disastrous effects of the mandate. Well, I believe the mandate will, I'm quite certain, eventually be invalidated in court. It's going to take some time for us to get there because right now we don't even have the mandate itself. We just have the threat of the mandate, and it's the imminent apprehension of the mandate's eventual issuance that's causing HR departments and general counsel's office offices in corporate America throughout this country today to scurry, to try to get ahead of the curve, and to develop their own policies so that they're in compliance as of day one when the mandate hits. But in the meantime, there's nothing to sue. There's no one to sue because there's no final agency action. There's no order in place. There's just the threat of it. This, I fear, is a feature, not a bug. Because by the time we actually have something on which to sue, by the time lawsuits are brought, by the time that litigation works its way to its natural conclusion, which I believe inevitably culminates in a finding that it's invalid, it's unconstitutional, it's not warranted by law, months, if not years, will have elapsed, and a lot of the damage will be done. So until that day that I consider inevitable when a court rules that this is unlawful, these bills, like the one that I've offered today, can provide businesses and the American people with the certainty that they need to make their own decisions. My bill that I've offered up today, the No Taxation Without Congressional Consent Act, would prohibit OSHA and other executive branch agencies in the federal government from imposing fines, fees, or taxes with respect to these mandates. It would protect our constitutional order by requiring that revenue measures be voted on by Congress, the branch of government most accountable to the people, and the only branch of government empowered to enact such policies. The other two branches cannot. As I mentioned yesterday, Madam President, the people concerned about this mandate are everyday Americans. I've now heard from 158 Utahns who are at risk of losing their jobs due to the mandate. And that number continues to grow every day. They are not our enemies, they are our neighbors. Many of them have been advised by board-certified doctors that they ought to not receive the vaccine. We shouldn't be punishing them or forcing them into second-class status. So today we have a choice. I hope that at some point my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will allow us to provide this certainty and peace of mind to those individuals and businesses at risk of suffering under the mandate. We can defend Congress's role as the branch of government that determines how and from whom revenue is to be raised. Not only can we do that, but we have an obligation to do that. We've all sworn an oath to uphold and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, and that document doesn't give the president this power. In fact, that document prohibits the president from exercising this power in the absence of congressional authorization, which we have not provided. So this bill, one of a dozen that I've submitted, could have passed this body today. I wish, for the sake of millions of concerned Americans, that it had. But regardless of this result today and of the objection that precluded it from passing the Senate today, I'm going to continue to fight. I'll keep coming back for as long as it takes in order to end this egregious and legally baseless and unconstitutional mandate. I find it interesting that my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from the state of Washington, referred to this as outrageous that we would be attempting to put in place protections for those Americans who are going to be victimized by the vaccine, who are going to have to choose between, on the one hand, receiving a medical procedure that they don't want, and on the other hand, being fired. Nobody should have to choose between submission and financial ruin. They especially shouldn't have to do that under the direction of an invalid, unconstitutional directive by the federal government. She also referred to what she described as, quote unquote, our efforts to, quote unquote, end this pandemic. This isn't about whether we want to end the pandemic. There's not a single person, Democrat, Republican, Independent, in this chamber or in the other chamber. I'm not sure I know a single American anywhere who wouldn't want to end this pandemic. This is not the pandemic. This is not going to end the pandemic. If anything, this will cause more people to be more reluctant to get the very vaccine that they're wanting to encourage others to provide. This is not about that. The minute we lose control of the government that is supposed to work for us, the minute we start to erode willfully, even for those who might be convinced that it's good policy, and I would disagree with them on that, the minute we decide to give this power to the President of the United States and stand silently as he usurps authority that under Article 1, Section 7 and Article 1, Section 8 plainly belongs only to Congress to the extent we have any business operating in this area to begin with as a federal government, which we do not, then we've simultaneously undermined both the vertical protection that we call federalism and the horizontal protection that we call separation of powers. Now, lest anyone might be left with the impression that this would be an esoteric or academic exercise, or that that's not something that affects their freedom, for those who would make that suggestion, they are sorely mistaken. You see, because anyone, anywhere, can have a Bill of Rights. In fact, as the late Justice Antonin Scalia used to point out, any tin-horn dictator around the world can have a Bill of Rights, and most of them do. Many of those bills of rights are scintillating documents. They're glowing in terms of their expression of individuality and the right of each human to exist and flourish. They'll articulate a list of rights that is in some cases comparable to, if not even more protective of individual liberty than our own Bill of Rights. And yet, as Justice Scalia continued, whether or not that Bill of Rights or any Bill of Rights is worth more than the paper that it's printed on ultimately rests on whether there are protections in place that guard against the dangerous accumulation of power in the hands of the few. That's what makes that difference. So if we allow a president today to adopt, whether you want to call it a tax or a fine or whatever revenue-raising tool that you choose to identify this as being, the president doesn't have the power to impose that. That's a legislative function. And Article 1, Section 7 is very clear. You cannot enact legislation, including any legislation collecting revenue from the citizenry, without passage in the House, passage in the Senate, and presentment to the President of the United States. He can't do it alone. That's what this is about. This is about so much more than just this vaccine mandate. But this vaccine mandate in and of itself is wrong, it's unconstitutional, it's harmful, and it has a tendency to undermine the very interests the President purports to be advancing. Thank you, Madam President. I want to be very clear. The limited focus of this bill, the bill that I offered up for passage in the Senate today, is narrow. It has one purpose. That for those Americans who have a medical concern and who had been advised by their doctor based on some condition associated with their health that they should not get it, they shouldn't have to choose between getting vaccinated and losing their job. My friend from Connecticut goes so far, I think, as to implicitly acknowledge that there ought to be an exception made for those people when he says President Biden's vaccine mandate accommodates them. Well, there's a problem with that. President Biden hasn't issued anything. He has suggested, along with members of his administration, that there might be some accommodation for them. I'm not sure what that means. Neither is corporate America. A lot of corporate America, acting on the advice of legal counsel and human resources departments, tends to be adopting rules already. Some of them take exceptions like these into account, others do not. Look, it's really not too much to ask to suggest that if you're going to impose a sweeping mandate like this, that you ought to have some protection for people with complicating medical conditions who, on the advice of a board-certified physician, choose not to get it. Now, again, this does not mean that I'm okay with the rest of the mandate. I'm not. And I respectfully but very strongly disagree with my friend's characterization that this is just fine for the federal government to do. The federal government lacks general police powers. The lion's share of the authority within government in our system lies with the states and their political subdivisions. Our national government is in charge of just a few basic and distinctively national matters: national defense, a uniform system of weights and measures, trademarks, copyrights, and patents, regulating trade or commerce between the states with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes. There are a handful of others, but there is no power in there that just refers to providing generally for laws to make the American people safe and healthy. Those powers exist in America. They just aren't vested in this government. It doesn't mean that states and localities will always exercise that power wisely or prudently or compassionately, but it means insofar as you're going to act through government, that's the appropriate place and not this one. Now, my friend from Connecticut then responds by saying, yeah, but the power's still there anyway. Even if I were to assume his point, that the power of the federal government somehow extends to an individual vaccine mandate, which it doesn't. And I'd challenge him or anyone else to cite what provision of the U.S. Constitution it is that provides that authority. But even if we were to accept the premise, just for purposes of discussion, that the federal government may exercise such authority, the president may not exercise that authority alone. The very first clause of the first article in the first section of the first article of that Constitution says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 7 then makes clear that in order to pass a law, a federal law in the United States, that is, in order to adopt a policy of the federal government, enforceable through the overpowering force that is the federal government, you have to follow the Article 1, Section 7 formula, which means you've got to take a legislative proposal, a bill, you've got to pass it in the House, and you've got to pass it in the Senate with the same language, and it has to be submitted to the president for signature, veto, or acquiescence. If you don't undertake that process at all, there is no authority in the executive to do anything like what they're describing. What President Biden has done is to arrogate to himself powers that he not only characterizes as federal, but really are legislative powers that he doesn't possess. The President of the United States is the chief executive. He's not a lawmaker, and he's certainly not the entire legislative branch. And so that really is quite beside the point. It doesn't make a difference with his federal authority. The fact that federal authority is asserted to exist, which it's not, and we can't identify a single clause of Article 1, Section 8 or another part of the Constitution that can fairly be read, especially against the backdrop of its original public meaning, to convey that power. But even if you concede that point, there's no reasonable, plausible, defensible argument that would say the President of the United States may wield this authority unilaterally. That is what despots and tyrants would have the power to do. And if there's one thing that's very consistent and uniform in our constitutional structure, it's that no one person, no one group of people is ever supposed to be able to accumulate dangerous degrees of power, and that the President of the United States is neither a lawmaker nor the entire legislative branch. He may not step into those shoes. As to the assertion about science, my friend and colleague referred to this as somehow a war on science. It's not a war on science to suggest that the president lacks authority to do something unilaterally. I'd call that a war on the Constitution, frankly. It's not a war on science to say that whenever a government acts, it ought to do so out of an abundance of caution and out of respect for the people, to provide reasonable accommodations to individuals who have medical conditions that make them uniquely vulnerable to what the government is inclined to require. Again, this mandate is unconstitutional. It doesn't make the vaccine bad. In fact, the vaccine is a blessing. And I think the American people have been made safer as a result of it. That doesn't mean every American must get it. It certainly doesn't mean that it's any of the federal government's business to tell people that they have to choose between getting the vaccine and losing their job, especially with regard to individuals who have pre-existing medical conditions that would make it dangerous for them to do so in the judgment of their board-certified medical physician. That's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. Now look, COVID-19 has imposed a lot of tragedies, and it is heartbreaking. A number of people we've lost to it, including the individuals who have died in the last month at Tallahassee Memorial Hospital, who he mentioned. Every one of those lives is of infinite, eternal value. Those are unrepeatable lives lost to a deadly pandemic. My heart goes out to each one of those souls who has departed along with their families. We're reminded of the lives that have tragically been lost to COVID-19 by an exhibit that's been up on the mall, up around the Washington Monument. It's beautiful, really. They're little flags, small flags, each of them white, each one representing one of the Americans that's been lost to COVID-19 since it broke out just over a year and a half ago. There are about 700,000 of those around the Washington Monument. From a distance, it looks a little like snow. I come from a state where there's usually snow at the top of mountains. It looks familiar to me when I see what looks like snow from a distance, but it's somber as I remember what they actually represent. We want to talk about the loss of human life. We have to talk about the loss of all human life, and we also have to talk about the right of each individual to live and to continue living and to follow the advice of medical doctors based on the individual's own medical conditions. I sometimes find staggering the accusations that those who have concerns with this are somehow committing a war on science. Against which science? Who exactly is it that's against science? It's science that tells us that unborn human life can experience and respond to pain in the womb in 15 or 20 weeks of gestational development. What would it look like if we had a separate memorial with little red flags instead of little white ones, each representing one of the human lives lost every single year to abortion? You see, every single year we lose about the same number of human lives to abortion as we've lost to COVID since it first broke out. If for the last 50 years we had a little red flag each marking one of those human lives lost, it'd be a sea of red. It'd take up not just the grass all around the Washington Monument, which is large. It'd probably take up all the grass between the Capitol, the Washington Monument, and the Lincoln Memorial. It'd be a sea of red. So no. you can't say that, that this is a war on science. To be concerned about individuals being able to make their own decision about whether to get this vaccine. And if you want to accuse people on the other side of the aisle of doing something, you've got to stop and think about other decisions that we make. Other decisions that some are willing to defend, decisions that involve a whole lot of human suffering and a whole lot of loss of a whole lot of human lives. Okay, I get that a lot of people disagree on these things, but the fact that we disagree on them doesn't mean they don't exist. It certainly doesn't mean that we can stand by and watch as if a vestigial legislative organ, as one single man steps into the shoes of 435 representatives and 100 senators and makes, as it were, a law on his own, a law that fails even to accommodate good faith medical concerns backed up by medical science. It's too bad that we couldn't pass this simple law today. We could have, we should have, I wish we would have. I'll be back. This issue isn't going away, neither am I. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in recent years, particularly those on the other side of the aisle, have called for, declared, and demanded that we rebuild what they call trust in government. Well, I believe that Americans must have a healthy distrust of the idea of government, and that any expansion of the necessarily limited powers of the federal government, that does not exempt government from the obligation of being trustworthy. That, Mr. President, is why I find the position that so many of my colleagues across the aisle are taking to be so confusing. Trust, but verify. Trust your neighbor, count the cards. People need information with which to analyze the faithfulness of government and to assess the facts as they deem appropriate. Now, they claim that Americans must be forced, coerced, prodded, cajoled, threatened into making the government-approved medical decision. But heaven forbid if someone resists, objects due to moral or religious belief, or opts out of being vaccinated due to specific, unique health concerns, she's derided and ignored. And if the current presidential administration has its way, forced out of her job. All of this is supposed to build a safer and more trusting society. This argument is totalitarian, and it's wrong. The United States is an open society, and the only way by which government can build trust with the American people is to earn it. And the government will earn that trust only through transparency. I've come to the Senate floor now 9 times to oppose President Biden's immoral, unwise, and damaging vaccine mandate. I've committed to keep this going for as long as it takes to beat the mandate. I've introduced now 12 bills to counteract, restrict, or limit the mandate. I do all this because I've heard from over 300 Utahns from one end of the state to the other who are at risk of losing their livelihoods due to this aggressive government overreach. Overreach of the government is staggering here. It's an overreach the likes of which we haven't seen in this country in a long time, the likes of which we arguably haven't seen since April 8th, 1952, when President Harry Truman seized every steel mill in America in order to support the Korean War effort. Now, fortunately, Within a couple of months, the Supreme Court of the United States acted and invalidated that maneuver as unlawful, unconstitutional, which of course it was. In this instance, that hasn't happened. Because with respect to the OSHA mandate, the employer mandate, the one saying that all employers with more than 99 employees have to comply, have to fire people who aren't vaccinated. There's nothing there because the authority doesn't exist. But in the meantime, corporate America is picking up the slack and doing the president's dirty work for him. But it is a government overreach, and it's an overreach that's harming good people, people who are not enemies of the United States. No, they're not enemies to anyone. They're our neighbors, our fellow citizens, and our friends. Their stories are as tragic as they are moving. And yet, this administration seems bent on assuming that they have no voice, on giving them no voice. Don't get me wrong, I'm not against the mandate. I'm against the mandate. I'm not against the vaccine. Not in any way. I'm fully vaccinated. My entire family's been vaccinated. I've encouraged people to get vaccinated for the specific reason that I see the vaccines as miracles, and miracles that are protecting many, many millions of Americans from the harms of COVID-19. But if government is trying to encourage Americans to get vaccinated, hiding information about their concerns with the vaccine is the worst possible way to build trust. It has the exact opposite of what they claim they're trying to do. Now, existing concerns, make no mistake, are not just going to evaporate if they're ignored. And the government's lack of transparency should be just as concerning to Americans who aren't worried about the vaccine as it is to those who are. Government should never be in the business of hiding information about the adverse effects and risks involved, no matter how infrequent or uncommon they might be. And the government has, let's face it, been less than forthright with information about vaccine complications. Adverse reactions to the vaccine have been documented since the COVID-19 shot became available. The administration's message has been, get the vaccine. It's safe, period. Now, if individuals pose questions about possible risks, about its interactions with other medical treatments, or about rare reactions seen directly after its administration, they're often pushed aside, denied proper care, or deemed crazy conspiracy theorists for trying to scare the public away from the vaccine. Now, sadly, this breeds distrust, and it threatens the ability of those who experience rare vaccine injuries, the ability to access the proper treatment, care, and respect they deserve. We should all be able to agree that this type of governmental deception has no place in the United States. That's why today I came to the floor to offer the Transparency in COVID-19 Vaccination Act. This bill would require the Secretary of Health and Human Services to publicly disclose all information regarding adverse effects of the COVID-19 vaccines. This sunshine would help clear the air and allow individuals and the medical community the opportunity to make informed decisions. This clarity would also be an important step toward building trust with the American public. Americans have the best, most accurate information when they make medical decisions, at least they try to. And they deserve to have the best and most accurate information when they make medical decisions. This bill would ensure that happens. That's why I came to the floor to offer it today, offer that we pass it, and offer the protections. Now, my friend and distinguished colleague, the senator from Washington, regrettably objected to it. In doing so, she argued that it's not necessary because, according to the senator from Washington, all the information that they need is now available. And in many instances, it's not. This bill would require that be made available. All of it. Yeah, the CDC does collect information on it, but the American people don't have access, full access to that information, and they should. That begs the question, why? Why would anyone want to do that? I don't know why. To me, it doesn't make sense, especially if one wants to increase the number of people getting the vaccine, as I do. I'd like to see more people getting vaccinated because I think the vaccine is something of a medical miracle, and it's protecting many, many millions of Americans from the harmful effects of COVID-19. That's a good thing. We want them to be protected. To be protected, we want them to get vaccinated. It doesn't mean government should force it on them, and it certainly doesn't mean that government should be perceived in any way as being less than forthcoming with information that it gains access to. That's all this bill would require. It's not hard. There's nothing wrong with doing that. And in fact, my colleague from Washington insists that it's already done. If that's the case, what's wrong with putting that into law? There isn't anything. We should do it. I'll be back on this and other topics related to the COVID-19 vaccine mandates. All this is unfortunate. No one is happy about the fact that COVID-19 has touched our country in the way that it has. It's been painful. It's devastating. You know, the 730,000 Americans who have died with COVID are tragedies, each and every one of them. Nothing about government overreach that will bring them back. There's certainly not anything about government overreach that's going to have a proper influence on the American people. There's certainly not anything about government hiding the ball when it comes to data that the American people deserve and want to have access to that's going to make people better. We want more people to get vaccinated, and because of that, we want them to have the facts. We should do that. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the United States is facing economic challenges that we haven't experienced in this country for decades. The supply chain crunch is leading to backlogged ports, and that, in turn, is spilling over into empty shelves. Inflation is exacting a punishing toll on American families, on their budgets, on their quality of life. It's not the well-off families that are being most harmed by it. No, it's those who are least prepared to endure that. It's America's poor and middle class, those who are working hard to survive from day to day, trying to reach that American dream, trying to ascend the economic ladder that the American dream has long enabled. Now, each of these problems in its own right would be a really serious and vexing primary concern for most people and most businesses, even during normal economic times. These are far from normal economic times. In fact, when businesses are pulled, their primary concern isn't about any of these things. It's the labor shortage. Businesses are struggling to find workers. The Joint Economic Committee Republicans released a report recently explaining that Americans have lost many vital connections to work. Government policies and social pressures are leading to a lower labor force participation rate than at any time in decades. This trend is worrying, not only because work helps Americans put food on the table, and it does, and it's necessary to do that, but also because work often provides a sense of accomplishment and belonging and self-worth. Work is a social good in its own right. But businesses across the country are struggling to find workers, and that's leading to more of these same problems. leading to higher prices on things that people need to buy. All this is making everything else more complicated, more difficult for America's poor and middle class. I've spoken to business owners in Utah who are closing their doors for days each week because they can't find workers. Some businesses are offering extremely generous salaries and signing bonuses to those who are willing to work. Nonetheless, they're still struggling to find employees. Now, work is often the primary connection Americans have with peers. Work provides a sense of involvement, taxpayer responsibility, and community with others. Work is also the way we get things done. It's how we manufacture, farm, mine, and build. Work is a requisite for prosperity at any level, in any form. Unfortunately, President Biden is making work more difficult and less enticing, increasingly less possible. Raising taxes on Americans gives them less incentive to work. And as the Penn-Wharton budget model shows, the Democrats' trimmed-down plan would cost almost $4 trillion over 10 years and cost American taxpayers $1.5 trillion in new taxes. Through his unconstitutional and sweeping vaccine mandate, President Biden is forcing countless American workers out of a job and preventing others from joining or rejoining the workforce. This is far from a mere abstract constitutional transgression. This is a constitutional violation that goes far beyond the text of a document and extends deeply into the lives of the American people, especially the poor and the middle class. I've now heard from over 300 Utahns who are at risk of losing their livelihoods due to this mandate. Their stories are gut-wrenching. Their stories are tragic. The stories remind me of how indefensible and inexcusable and immoral this vaccine mandate truly is. These are ordinary, everyday, hardworking Americans who all too often are just trying to make ends meet, put food on the table, provide for their families, and otherwise get by. Many of them have legitimate medical, moral, or religious objections. Many of them work for employers who have no desire to implement the mandate and who themselves are worried about their ability to keep their businesses open. Now, I've heard from a number of Utah businesses whose management and ownership has expressed these exact same feelings. And I've heard from Utah workers who have expressed these feelings over and over and over again. Let me tell you about a few people I've heard from who describe this awful situation. Now, one Utah business in the high-tech space has expressed concern about losing valuable employees due to the mandate. The business that I'm referring to at the moment has implemented policies to encourage vaccination and recognizes, of course, the value that vaccination can bring to the workforce. Nonetheless, the business owners are uncomfortable with making these decisions for their employees. The business's management said, quote, "We feel strongly that it's not the government's right to require vaccination." They're absolutely right. A growing Utah food manufacturer with 350 employees is very worried about the mandate's impact on that company's ability to keep product moving. This business plays an important role in food supply chains in Utah, throughout the western United States, and throughout the country. Leaders of this business said, quote, "The mandate is government overreach, is outside the scope and purpose of OSHA, and will have dire consequences on our company and our economy in this extremely tight labor market." They know that some of their workforce would quit if the mandate were enforced. Another Utah business is similarly worried. This larger operations leadership said, quote, "We're in a difficult labor situation. It's a daily struggle to be fully staffed and produce the products our customers expect. Some of our employees have stated that they will quit if forced to be vaccinated. Any disruption in our labor force will be critical to our operations. And a disruption in our labor force not only means some of our customers may not receive products they expect, it may mean local time-sensitive supply would not get processed. That disruption would be devastating, close quote. Now, Mr. President, it's important here that I not be misunderstood. I'm against the mandate, but I support the vaccine. I've been vaccinated. I've encouraged others to be vaccinated. These vaccines are helping countless people avoid the harms associated with COVID-19. But this mandate is already doing serious harm to our economy and to people who want the right, the basic human right, to make their own medical decisions. That's why I, along with my colleague, the senator from Kansas, Dr. Marshall, Senator Marshall and I have sent a letter directly to the Majority Leader, Senator Schumer. We've advised him months before the current spending period ends in December that we will oppose any funding legislation that enables the enforcement of President Biden's employer vaccine mandate. It's essential to remember here that Congress, the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals, this is where the Constitution places the power of the purse. This is where the Constitution places the power to pass legislation. Congress, not the President, has the authority to decide how federal funds are spent. Now, we believe our funds would be misspent in this way or any endeavor that would harm Utahns and Kansans and all Americans, would worsen our difficult economic situation or would take away fundamental medical freedoms. This now marks the 13th day that I've come to the Senate floor to oppose the mandate. I'm going to continue to do so for as long as it takes to beat the mandate. I encourage all of my colleagues to join me in this effort. And when I say that, I want to be clear. I'm not speaking to one side of the aisle or the other. I invite all to join me in this cause. Why? Well, because Americans overwhelmingly, regardless of whether they live in a red state or a blue state or a purple state, Americans overwhelmingly oppose this mandate. According to a poll recently reported on in Axios, hardly a right-wing publication, revealed that 14%, just 14% of Americans believe that the response to someone not receiving the vaccine should involve them losing their job. Just 14% of Americans agree with President Biden that you should have to choose between keeping your job and getting a vaccine that might go against your religious beliefs or that might worsen a pre-existing medical condition that has caused your doctor to advise you to be cautious in getting the vaccine. These decisions, Mr. President, are not those of the President of the United States to make. You see, he doesn't have that power. My copy of the Constitution says that the power to make law rests in this branch of government, the legislative branch, the Congress. And my copy of the Constitution says that he can't make law, which he essentially did when he purported to have and purported to plan to exercise the power, unilaterally, acting alone, to require every worker at every employer that has more than 100 employees, more than 99 employees, to get the vaccine or be fired. This isn't right. Deep down, the American people know it's right. Deep down, they know that this is not a partisan issue. This is an unabashed power grab by the President of the United States. It's not one that is of the sort that the American people will accept kindly. I've said before, I'm not sure I can think of a more egregious example of a president exercising power that's not his own in many decades. This is in some ways reminiscent of President Harry Truman's decision to seize every steel mill in America. in order to make sure that the output could be dedicated to the Korean War effort. The American people didn't smile upon that one, neither did the Supreme Court of the United States, which within weeks of President Truman's action on April 8, 1952, decided that he didn't have that authority. Some may ask, well, if it's so unconstitutional here, why hasn't the Supreme Court acted? Well, I'll tell you why. Because President Biden hasn't had the basic decency to issue an order explaining the basis for his authority and providing a basis for someone to challenge the legitimacy of his authority to order every business with more than 99 employees to force its entire workforce to get vaccinated. He hasn't had the decency to do that. Consequently, no one can sue yet. Consequently, employers everywhere with more than 99 employees are forced to guess as to what it will look like. In the meantime, their lawyers, with good reason, and their risk management departments and their human resources departments are understandably saying, you know, we don't want to get caught flat-footed, especially because we've been threatened as employers with $70,000 per day per person mounting civil monetary penalties. This would be crippling to literally any business. And so what are they doing? Well, they're getting ahead of it. They're guessing as to what the most extreme version of the OSHA mandate might look like, and then they're exceeding that. And they're already in the process of threatening termination, and in some ways, in some cases, imposing it. In many cases, Mr. President, they're not even having the decency to fire them. They instead put them on unpaid administrative leave. This is especially cruel because it renders them completely ineligible for unemployment. So, Mr. President, I ask you, is this moral? Is this just? Setting aside for a moment the question of whether this is constitutional, and I assure you unequivocally it is not. But even setting aside that question, is it moral? Is it proper? Is it acceptable to do this to America's poor and middle class? It is not. Thank you, Mr. President. You have the floor.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, I was going to give a speech. First, I'm now going to invert the order, and I'll do my unanimous consent request first in deference to my friend and colleague, the senator from Rhode Island. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Armed Services Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-2842, and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and pass, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President, reserving the right to object, I object. I also want to thank the senator from Utah for his consideration.
The objection is heard.
Madam President, our armed forces have been asked to work miracles over the last 18 months. During a global pandemic, in the face of natural disasters and facing dangerous missions, our men and women in uniform have risen to the challenge, just as they have so many times throughout our history. Many of our service members have contracted and then recovered from COVID. Now these heroes, the same heroes, are being placed in a corner by this administration. President Biden's COVID vaccine requirement for the armed forces does not grant our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines the respect that they deserve. As the Senate debates our annual National Defense Authorization Act, it would be a huge mistake not to consider the mandate's impact on our retention and recruitment of service members, and thus our military's readiness to secure our national security. This mandate, tied with President Biden's more sweeping general vaccine mandate, is something that, in combination, has put millions of Americans in so many difficult, untenable, unfair positions. In most cases, these are hardworking, everyday Americans. They're mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, just trying to put food on the table during difficult economic times. These mandates are forcing millions of our fellow citizens into second-class, unemployable status, placing countless of our neighbors on the economic and social fringes of our society. Even more than what they're already experiencing with rampant inflation caused by excessive government spending to the tune of trillions of dollars. Now, I've heard from hundreds of Utahns in recent days who are concerned about losing their jobs. Losing their jobs not just in general, not just in the abstract, but specifically due to these mandates. Some of these individuals are heroic members of our military. These service members were rightly praised for serving during a pandemic and serving in dangerous conditions, on dangerous missions. But now they're being forced out, often with limited or no retirement benefits because of the President's mandate. Now, let me share with you just a few of their stories. One soldier told me his story. He's been in the Army now for 18 years, nearly 2 decades. He never received a single reprimand, whether written or otherwise. He honorably and proudly served his nation. All along, he was planning on retiring upon reaching 2 decades of service. He's almost there at 18 years. Just 18 months shy, in fact, of reaching that really important milestone in his career. But now, because of the vaccine mandate, he's at risk of losing his benefits and not even receiving an honorable discharge. Regarding his situation, he said, quote, "This will cause a substantial loss in pay and quality of life for myself and a large number of others I know," close quote. Another soldier who reached out to my office has served for 10 years in the military. He's been informed, despite his many years of successful, faithful, active duty service, that he will not receive an honorable discharge if he declines to comply with the vaccine requirement. Accordingly, he asked to resign from the military. Now, his commanders made clear that he'd be barred from resignation. He sought a personal religious exemption. He was summarily told his exemption request would be denied. Of his situation, he said, quote, "To be backed into a corner with 2 very bad options is both disheartening and sad, especially with what I've sacrificed and what my family has sacrificed on behalf of the military," close quote. Another soldier reached out to my office in a similar situation. This soldier has children who experienced complications with receiving the vaccine. This soldier also has a child with significant learning disabilities who he's worried about providing for. He said, quote, "This really could be a life-changing event for my family. And I feel strongly enough about it that I will risk all my benefits not to take it. I just wish I had a choice," close quote. These stories are just barely scratching the surface of the countless thousands of service members in similar positions. The Department of Defense has begun prohibiting unvaccinated members of the National Guard from receiving federal pay or benefits. These guardsmen risk being marked absent from training drills if they're not vaccinated. This move has the effect of pushing the unvaccinated out of the National Guard. Approximately 10,000 Marines remain unvaccinated. That's around 6% of the Corps. Losing these capable service members and showing unvaccinated Americans that they should not join our armed forces makes our military less capable. It threatens its ability to do what only the military can do. In total, there are reports of approximately 60,000 unvaccinated service members who risk discharge under less than honorable conditions due to this mandate. 60,000. The Department of Defense, for its part, refuses to provide the number of service members who have applied for vaccine exemptions. But there are reports that even some of the few Americans in military uniform who have received exemptions are seeing those exemptions revoked. That's chilling, to say the least. Relatively few of them are getting them granted. Some of those who have had them granted are seeing them revoked. Now, these service members, like millions of other Americans whose employment has also been put at risk, they all deserve a better option. That's why today I'm asking that the Senate pass my Respecting Our Service Members Act. That's why I came to the Senate floor and why a few moments ago I asked unanimous consent that we pass it. Look, I know not everyone is going to agree on every issue here, and that we're not going to agree perhaps on every issue pertaining to the mandate, but I think we at least ought to be able to agree on this one. We ought not be mistreating those upon whom our safety depends. This bill that I brought forward to try to pass today would prohibit the Secretary of Defense from requiring COVID vaccination for our military. I'm grateful to my colleagues, Senators Braun and Tuberville, for joining me. This is now the 18th time I've come to the Senate floor asking that the federal government take a tempered, reasoned approach, an approach that's noticeably absent from that which the President has chosen to pursue. And as I've said every time I've done this, I'm not anti-vaccine. I believe the development of the COVID vaccines is something of a medical miracle. I'm vaccinated. My family's vaccinated. I've encouraged everyone around me to get the vaccine. But I've also acknowledged that's not my decision, and it's certainly not a decision that should be forced on them by the federal government. And certainly not by a single person acting within the federal government who shouldn't be exercising that authority unilaterally. Whether or not vaccines should be mandated by the federal government is, of course, an entirely different freestanding question. Our military service members deserve the right to make this medical decision for themselves without the threat of losing the ability to care for themselves and provide for their families. They currently face being forced out of the military, out of military service, but also out of the benefits that they've earned. And to add insult to injury, they also are threatened with the risk of a less than honorable discharge. All for the supposed grave sin of daring to deviate from presidential medical orthodoxy. We're better than this. This is not something that we should be doing. Everyone knows it. Deep down, we know it's wrong. You know, according to a recent Axios poll, only 14% of the American people agree with President Biden's apparent assumption that someone should be fired as a consequence of declining to get the vaccine. That's wrong. That's why I came here today. That's why I'll be back as many times, as long as it takes, to end these mandates. Madam President, it's unfortunate that this legislation, which should be easy to pass, it's unfortunate that it wasn't able to pass today. It's unfortunate that it drew an objection. The American people don't want this, and our national security is undermined by it. I find that most unfortunate, and I'll continue to fight it. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. And note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, Congress, not the executive, makes the laws in this country. National laws have to be passed by the legislative branch. Our Constitution makes that very clear. In fact, it's the very first clause of the first section of the first article of the Constitution that states unambiguously, all legislative powers herein vested shall be granted in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. You cannot make a federal law without going through that formula. Passage in the House, passage in the Senate, followed by presentment to the President. In the case of COVID-19 vaccine requirements, the President of the United States has decreed mandates that threaten the jobs and the livelihoods of 45 million Americans, including over 500,000 Utahns whose jobs are on the line. Now, courts across the country have started quite correctly to recognize that these mandates are offensive to the Constitution, that they're not authorized by the law. But that doesn't diminish in any way, shape, or form our duty here as members of the United States Senate, as part of the legislative branch, to assert clearly, unambiguously, and swiftly that these mandates are unconstitutional, illegal, and morally indefensible. I've heard from hundreds of Utahns who are themselves at risk of losing their jobs and therefore their ability to provide food for their children, specifically due to these mandates. Their stories are nothing short of heartbreaking. I've heard from countless businesses in my state, businesses that are afraid of losing key workers and having to shut their doors and no longer operate, specifically due to these mandates. I've heard from people who happen to have medical or religious concerns about the vaccines, and their pleas are falling on deaf ears. Now, these Americans aren't asking for anything extravagant or unusual or unreasonable. Far from it. These are Americans who are simply worried about their ability to put food on the table and gifts under the tree during challenging economic times that are difficult enough as it now stands, economic times that have been worsened by excessive government spending, economic times that are about to get a whole lot more difficult for a whole lot more people, specifically because of these mandates. President Biden seeks to make them not only unemployed, Mr. President, but also unemployable, second-class pariahs. Now, it's true. The courts have offered temporary relief to some, but these Americans and these businesses look to Congress for immediate, lasting, and permanent relief. We do, after all, make the law. We're the only branch of the federal government authorized to do so. So, Mr. President, this will be one of the easiest votes that I've ever cast in my 11 years in the Senate. The American people agree. Only 14% of those polled support firing those who are unvaccinated. 14% of all Americans say that, yeah, somebody who doesn't get the vaccine ought to be fired as a result of not getting the vaccine. Even some Democratic politicians are starting to change tune. They're souring on the mandates. Americans understand that conditioning employment on personal medical decisions is callous, it's cruel, and it is immoral. It's certainly not something that these people want to face. It's not something that Democrats or Republicans want. It's not something they agree with. It's not something they're going to tolerate. The economic impact of firing 500,000 Utahns would be disastrous. And when you replicate the effects of doing that on state after state where we see, according to many data sets, anywhere from a quarter to a third of the workforce in most states is being threatened by these. In some states, it's higher. It's more like 40% in places like West Virginia, 37% in Alabama, 31% in Utah. Now, in the healthcare sector alone, we're keeping doctors and nurses and technicians at work has been particularly difficult. The nation risks losing countless thousands of key professionals. While the need for their very services remains most dire. This isn't acceptable. It's not something we want to see. It's not something we should have to face. When you add all of this up, the cumulative effect across different industries and in different states across the nation would be catastrophic. As we face supply chain troubles, inflation, rising gas prices, a labor shortage, and so much more. The very last thing our economy needs is to have tens of millions of Americans unemployed. Okay, I'm very, very much against these mandates. I am for the vaccines. I've been vaccinated. My family's been vaccinated. I've encouraged people everywhere to get vaccinated. But when someone chooses not to be vaccinated for whatever reason, whether it's a medical reason, a religious reason, a reason related to personal belief, or due to a specific concern about a specific reaction they've had to something else, it's still their decision. It still doesn't warrant the overpowering hand of the federal government coming in and threatening to force their employers to fire them under the threat of crippling penalties. Penalties that any employer, no matter how big or wealthy or otherwise lucrative, would find incapacitating. I've come to the Senate floor now 20 times to speak specifically against President Biden's vaccine mandates. I've offered more than a dozen bills to reduce their harms on millions of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Utahns. Today, with my colleagues, I encourage the Senate to use the Congressional Review Act as it was intended. There's no clearer example in the history of the Congressional Review Act of such an egregious overstep by the executive. There's no more blatant abuse of delegated authority or usurpation of authority that was never granted. The Congressional Review Act provides us with the opportunity to strike down this offensive mandate and make sure that neither President Biden nor any subsequent president can institute a similar rule. I encourage my colleagues to think of the 500,000 Utahns, the almost 5 million Californians, the 300,000 West Virginians, and tens of millions elsewhere across the nation. 45 million livelihoods are at stake. Workers and families in each of our states. These Americans demand that we take action. Today we have that choice. I implore each and every one of my colleagues to stand with the American people, the American worker, the American family, by supporting this resolution. Thank you. Mr. President.
The senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I'm here on the Senate floor now for the 21st time, specifically to oppose President Biden's sweeping vaccine mandates. I've introduced over a dozen bills to, one way or another, limit, clarify, or counteract the mandates. Every time I've come to ask the Senate to pass what should frankly be uncontroversial matters, one of my colleagues or another from the aisle, from the other side of the aisle, has come to object. This is unfortunate. It's unfortunate really for a number of reasons. These mandates, while currently being challenged in court in a number of jurisdictions, show the terrible power that even the threat of a vaccine mandate can wield. Businesses across the country are suspending, punishing, and firing employees who haven't had the COVID shot. The threat of the mandate is making it harder for everyday American families just to put food on the table, and to do so, moreover, in increasingly difficult economic times. Now, these are not our enemies. These are not people to be feared. These are not people to shun or loathe entirely, as the mandates seem to suggest, no, these are our friends and our neighbors. These are mothers and fathers. These are people who, like far too many Americans, are just struggling to get by. And I'm going to continue to fight for them, to protect them, because they understand something that President Biden has yet to accept, even though deep down I know he does know it. And that is, this isn't right. It's not right for him to do. It's not right constitutionally for about a dozen reasons. But it's also just not right morally. It's a morally unacceptable proposition to suggest that someone should get fired just because they don't conform to presidential medical orthodoxy. It's immoral to tell someone that their ability to put food on the table for their children depends on whether they get a shot that they may or may not want, a shot that may or may not conflict with their religious or sincerely held beliefs, that might be contraindicated by one or more conditions, resulting in their doctor advising them not to get the shot. This is not something that anyone should do. And in fact, the American people agree. According to a recent Axios poll, only 14% of Americans, just 14 out of every 100 Americans, agrees with the apparent position of the President of the United States that if someone doesn't get the shot, that they should be fired. I would imagine if it's even fewer than that, and 14 out of 100 isn't very many to begin with, but I'm pretty sure it's even fewer than that, far fewer, who would say that it's okay for one person within the federal government to decide to fire everyone who doesn't comply within the government, and also to tell private employers that they'll receive crippling, company-destroying fines that no company, not even the wealthiest out there, could live with if they don't fire every one of their employees or otherwise take adverse action against them, declining to take the shot. It's not okay. In this effort, I have, to be sure, been supremely clear. I am not in any way against the COVID-19 vaccinations. Quite to the contrary. I have been vaccinated. I've encouraged people to seek out all the relevant information and be vaccinated. I believe that the COVID-19 vaccines are keeping countless Americans safe from the harm threatened by the COVID-19 virus. This is different than that. That fact doesn't undercut, and it can't offset the fact that this mandate is pushing government control beyond the constitutional limits and into the private decisions of the American people. That's why I'm against all these mandates for all age groups. And that's why I've come to the Senate floor repeatedly to help and to call on my colleagues and President Biden himself to end this madness once and for all, to end it before it's too late, to end it before irreparable harm is inflicted on those who, for whatever reason, can't or are otherwise inclined not to comply with his directions. I've even offered a bill, one that should be unusually, uniquely uncontroversial, but even that one met objection. It was a simple reaffirmation of parental rights that our government has respected and honored and even protected from the beginning. My Parental Consent for Vaccination Act would simply require that any COVID-19 vaccine mandate issued by the federal government, and to be clear, it shouldn't be issuing any at all, but any of them that it happens to issue must be a mandate that includes a requirement that informed parental consent be provided before the shot can be administered to a minor. Now, this one is so far afield from the broader question of whether we should have these mandates at all, the slightly narrower question of whether the President of the United States should administer them. It really should not be controversial. Now, allow me to put this issue in some context here. Parental consent is required for all sorts of things. Parental consent, as every parent with school-age children knows, is required for field trips. Parental consent is required for pretty much all extracurricular activities. For that matter, it's required for many in-class activities. Parental consent is required before most schools can administer so much as a Tylenol or a baby aspirin to a child. Everyone knows that. None of that is happening without parental consent. And that is, to be sure, the right approach. It's as it should be. Despite what some candidates have said in some recent political campaigns, parents should be informed and involved in their children's education, and certainly in their child's health decisions, in matters of medical treatment. Parents, it's important to remember, are simply better equipped to make these decisions. Parents know their children, and they know their children's medical history. Parents know their moral, their religious, and their health requirements that are, in many cases, unique to their family. Certainly something that no government and no school can keep track of in the same way that a government or a school could. Parents also love their children. That's important here. And parents, because they love their children, they have their children's best interests at heart when they make decisions affecting them. Government can't do any of those things. It certainly can't do any of those things anywhere close to as well as a parent could. And the reason for that, Mr. President, is fairly simple. It's because government doesn't have arms with which to embrace children. Government doesn't have a heart with which to love children. Government doesn't even have eyes to see or ears to hear, because government, of course, when reduced to its essence, when we really define it as what it is, it's simply force. It's legally authorized violence. Now, thank heaven that God and the law have always assigned primary care of their children to parents and not to government. Government is just the official, actual, or threatened use of force. We need government. It's also one of the many reasons why we've got to be careful with it. It's like other things that we rely on in so many ways. Things like electricity, like moving water, like fire. They're all necessary to our day-to-day lives. And yet, when left uncontrolled, they're dangerous and quickly become fatal when we don't exercise due caution. This has, of course, been acknowledged for millennia. It's been written about widely for many, many centuries, even centuries before the founding of our republic. And it's been acknowledged since the very earliest days of our republic. George Washington himself warned the people about this, warning that government is itself force and is therefore dangerous and has to be carefully managed. That's why we have a Constitution. That's why we have all these rules about government. If men were angels, we wouldn't need government. If we had access to angels to run our government, as James Madison described in Federalist 51, then we wouldn't have to worry about government abusing its power, and we wouldn't need all these rules. But we're not angels. Men and women are not angels, and we don't have access to angels to run our government, and so we have to have rules governing the use of government. And it's for our own safety. Nowhere is this more important than with respect to our children. That's where we can really see laid bare the essential core facts of what government is, which is the actual or threatened use of coercive force. Now, I also thank heaven above that God didn't assign the anonymous masses on the internet to care for children. The pressure children receive through social media, through news publications, and common video sites lacks nuance in any specific understanding of a child's health condition or history or religious beliefs. There are even reports in prominent magazines of children being advised to commit fraud or cross state lines to be vaccinated specifically against their parents' advice, circumventing parental authority. There is a reason why the FDA requires the fine print and the sometimes very painfully exhaustive and descriptive side effect warnings on pharmaceutical advertisements, and why those ads always encourage viewers to consult their doctors. But in the brave new world of Big Brother healthcare, students aren't encouraged to consult their parents, let alone their doctors. Unfortunately, in some places, like here in our nation's capital, government has completely lost the plot. In the District of Columbia school system, for example, minors can receive medical procedures without the school even informing the parents. In other places across the nation, this slippery slope is already leading governments to consider life-changing, school-provided medical procedures without parental notice and without parental consent. Now, as a parent, this thought sends shivers down my spine. I know I'm not alone in that respect. Far from it. Most Americans, regardless of what part of the country they come from, regardless of creed, political affiliation, socioeconomic status, or any other single factor, if they're parents, they're going to feel the same way. They don't like the idea of someone else taking over the raising of their child. They don't like the idea of government taking control of medical decisions on behalf of their child. You see, that's supplanting their role. That's moving them out of the way. School-age kids are also some of those least at risk of contracting, spreading, and suffering long-term or serious effects from COVID. The data have shown this all along. The vaccines, on the other hand, may pose a more serious risk to some young people than they do to the general population. Various countries, including France and Germany, have ceased recommending some COVID vaccines to those under the age of 30 because of complications. Again, I'm not against these vaccines, but the thought of schools, social media, or heaven forbid, government pressuring students into vaccination without parental consent is rightfully troubling. It's downright chilling, and it should not happen, not here. Not in the United States of America. While the federal government has almost no legitimate role in influencing local education decisions, we can make sure that the federal government does not endorse or, heaven forbid, mandate this dangerous approach to medical decisions for minors. That's not too much to ask. That's not something that should be controversial here in the United States Senate. That's not something that is remotely controversial among the good people of this country. left and right, rich and poor, if their parents, they're deeply disturbed by the thought of the cold, impersonal force that is government, pushing them out of the way to make medical decisions for them and for their children. So, Mr. President, let's provide assurance to parents and children. Let's reaffirm our commitment to supporting parents in making decisions for their children. Let's protect kids, and let's end these mandates. They're illegal, they're unconstitutional, and they're morally indefensible. Thank you, Mr. President.